You are already dying, slowly, and the weapon is silence. We have been expertly conditioned to believe that solitude is strength, that true self-mastery requires the ruthless eradication of dependence, and that our greatest achievement is standing alone on some self-congratulatory pedestal. This is the single most destructive myth of the modern age, a cultural sickness we not only tolerate but actively celebrate, and it is killing us with the same mechanical efficiency as a pack of unfiltered cigarettes every single day. Loneliness is not a charming melancholic quirk or a temporary emotional state. It is a profound, life-threatening biological signal that we have collectively learned to mute, and the cost of silencing that alarm is nothing less than physical and existential decay. My thesis is simple, brutal, and medically defensible. Loneliness is a physical trauma. It is not sadness. It is chronic stress deployed by the nervous system, turning the body into a battlefield. When the brain registers social disconnection, the lack of reliable reciprocal human bonds, it does not shrug and move on. It panics. It releases a torrent of cortisol, the primal alarm hormone, because historically, being alone meant certain death by predator or famine. We are genetically coded to exist in tribes, and when the tribe vanishes, our internal architecture interprets this abandonment as an immediate life or death emergency. That chronic state of alarm is what drives systemic inflammation, the silent precursor to almost every major killer in the developed world, from heart disease and diabetes to dementia. When researchers established that the mortality risk associated with social isolation is chemically equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day, they weren't being dramatic. They were detailing the precise biological cost of betraying our fundamental nature. We are, quite literally, dying of self-sufficiency. If you prefer the unsettling, rigorous truth over comforting, curated lies, if you're tired of the shallow, motivational noise plaguing the internet, then stop scrolling for a second, hit the subscribe button, and join those who are willing to look directly into the dark mechanisms of human behavior. You are not just subscribing to a channel. You are joining a refusal to ignore the things society demands we politely overlook. The greatest trick isolation ever played was convincing the individual that their suffering was unique and self-inflicted, therefore preventing them from seeking the very connection that would heal them. We are told through endless content streams and self-help gurus that the path to resilience is internal, a solo mission of grinding productivity and emotional iron walls. But this manufactured independence is nothing but social atrophy. Think of the neurological structures responsible for empathy, vulnerability, and trust. Like any muscle left unused, they begin to wither. When genuine connection finally appears, a chance to truly open up, to accept help, or to admit weakness, the isolated individual finds they are structurally incapable of doing so. Their social receptors have been scarred over, not by malice, but by long-term disuse. They become trapped in a self-reinforcing loop. The pain of loneliness is what drove them inward, and the atrophy caused by being inward now makes returning to the world feel physically terrifying. This is the psychological paradox of the lone wolf. The creature celebrated for its independence is, in reality, suffering from a debilitating handicap. We have mistaken the capacity to endure suffering for the capacity to thrive, and the moment we confuse enduring the silence with overcoming it, we set the timer on our own expiration. The modern individual is often wealthy, entertained, and absolutely terrified of needing another human being. We invest millions in anti-aging creams, supplements, and biohacks, trying desperately to extend life, all while simultaneously performing a high-stakes, chronic self-poisoning by choosing the psychological environment of a solitary existence. The real longevity hack isn't found in a pill or a diet. It's found in the consistent, messy, sometimes annoying reality of deep human obligation. That obligation, the commitment to another person's existence, is the antidote to the cortisol bath, the regulator of the systemic inflammation, and the single greatest protector against the diseases that feast on the disconnected soul. We need to stop viewing interdependence as a weakness and recognize it for what it is, the most sophisticated form of biological armor available to us. What drives this lethal choice? It is the desperate, exhausting search for frictionless existence. The modern mind, trained by technology to demand instantaneous results and flawless interactions, recoils violently from the inherent inefficiency of human connection. To truly rely on another means forfeiting control over outcomes, exposing yourself to their bad days, their irrationalities, their unique pace. The lone wolf chooses isolation not primarily out of strength, but out of a profound intolerance for psychological friction. We have automated our lives so ruthlessly that we have begun to automate vulnerability away entirely, equating emotional exposure with a systemic failure of our personal operating system. We believe we are protecting ourselves from pain, when in fact we are just trading the intense, momentary suffering of a necessary conflict for the dull, chronic background ache of existential emptiness. This avoidance is masked as sovereignty, but it is just cowardice dressed in tactical gear. The ego whispers a seductive lie. You can optimize yourself into a condition where the world is merely optional. It promises that if you just work hard enough, meditate deep enough, or biohack ruthlessly enough, you will transcend the messy necessity of mutual aid. But this is the fatal flaw in the self-improvement industrial complex. It often sells an end state of untouchable autonomy when the only viable end state is a deeper, more committed form of entanglement. The true psychological depth we seek is not found in the silence of the self, but in the noisy, unpredictable feedback loop provided by a committed witness. If you feel this cold analysis of the human condition is resonating, if you recognize these invisible, crippling mechanisms in your own life, then you understand the stakes of missing the next step in this discussion. Stop letting the algorithm decide what deep truth you encounter next. Hit that subscribe button right now to ensure you don't miss the essential countermeasures to this psychological pathology. The isolated individual is not just rejecting others, they are actively removing the only mirror capable of showing them their own operational flaws. Without the friction of another consciousness pushing back, challenging assumptions, demanding accountability, or simply refusing to validate a flawed narrative, the lone wolf's self-perception becomes not just biased, but dangerously brittle. They construct a monument to a perfect self, a psychological edifice that cannot withstand even the smallest external critique, because it has never been stress-tested by genuine intimacy. Loneliness thus evolves from an emotional state into a form of self-sabotaging intellectual censorship. We cease to receive the complex, often painful data necessary for real growth, confusing the absence of confrontation with the attainment of wisdom. We become experts at managing our own curated internal environment, but utterly unskilled at navigating the actual world, which is inherently chaotic, judgmental, and unfair. And this is precisely why true interdependence is so frightening. It mandates the continuous, painful work of letting others see the parts of us we spend a lifetime hiding, the hypocrisies, the fears, the unresolved contradictions. The lone wolf doesn't fear pain. They fear being definitively seen and found wanting. They prefer the ambiguous suffering of solitude to the specific, terrifying verdict of a trusted confidant. This preference is what transforms a temporary period of self-reflection into a permanent psychological cage. We are trading the genuine relief of burden sharing for the illusory safety of carrying the crushing weight alone. Analyzing the pathology of isolation, the way the modern mind retreats into a controlled environment to avoid the complexity required for meaning, demands intellectual rigor that filler content simply cannot deliver. This kind of unfiltered psychological excavation relies entirely on the support of those who prioritize depth over distraction. If you value this commitment to articulating the necessary, often uncomfortable counter-narrative, please subscribe. It is your commitment that keeps this essential perspective alive, pushing back against the tide of superficial advice. The final, hidden transaction the lone wolf makes is the exchange of depth for control. They gain operational smoothness. No last-minute cancellations, no emotional demands, no compromising on scheduling, but they lose the only known source of profound personal evolution. Every single leap in human consciousness, every transformative moment in a life, is catalyzed by an external force, a person, an event, or a text that shattered the existing self-concept. By insulating themselves, the isolated individual effectively eliminates the statistical probability of that necessary shattering, thereby guaranteeing psychological stagnation. They become masters of maintenance, brilliantly preserving a small, manageable, but ultimately meaningless life. The psychological gravity of this truth pulls us toward a singular, uncompromising verdict. The cult of radical self-reliance, the relentless pursuit of independence as a core virtue, is a philosophical poison. It promises strength, but delivers atrophy. It promises peace, but guarantees a deeper, colder war waged entirely within the confines of the self. The choice before us is not between self-sufficiency and weakness, but between a brittle, controlled existence and a robust, messy, meaningful one. The true definition of that philosophical poison is its insidious mandate: never risk the ego for the sake of the soul. We see this pathology played out daily in the lives of the hyper-competent. Consider the archetype of the emotionally pristine technocrat, the architect of efficiency whose professional life is a testament to rigorous foresight and control. They can manage billion-dollar budgets, optimize global supply chains, or engineer software that runs essential infrastructure. In the theater of the market, they are gods, but observe their private life. It is a sterile landscape of transactional interactions. Their friendships are strictly utilitarian. Their romantic relationships are meticulously risk-managed partnerships based on shared logistics rather than terrifying, messy, genuine desire. They have perfected the art of compartmentalization to the extent that they have surgically removed the capacity for true vulnerability. They mistake emotional stability for emotional emptiness, using competence as an elaborate shield against being known. The isolated mind views vulnerability not as a prerequisite for intimacy, but as a critical vulnerability, a bug in the system of the self. They would rather suffer alone, solving their internal crisis through pure brute force intellectual processing, than ask for help, because asking for help means momentarily surrendering the self-constructed illusion of impenetrable strength. This is where the cost becomes astronomical. They lose access to the symbiotic correction that only deep relationships provide. No matter how brilliant you are, you have fundamental blind spots that your internal logic cannot resolve. It is only the trusted external eye that can reflect back the distortion, the self-deception, the error in the core assumption. The isolated genius is condemned to repeat the same core mistake, polished to a higher degree of intellectual sophistication each time, because the mirror they hold up is always secretly convex. This deeper intellectual dive, the exploration of the cognitive traps that masquerade as virtues, requires a consistent commitment to honesty, a refusal to offer easy answers. If you find this analysis challenging your ingrained assumptions about independence and are committed to supporting content that relentlessly pursues psychological clarity over fleeting comfort, please consider subscribing. It is the fuel that drives this engine of necessary inquiry, allowing us to keep examining the shadows others prefer to ignore. The core deception of self-reliance is its promise that the inherent human burden can be negotiated down to zero. This is a physiological and spiritual lie. The burden is fundamental to existence. The only choice we possess is how we carry it. The self-reliant choose the burden of absolute autonomy. This burden is heavier than the burden of responsibility to others because it is utterly silent. There is no witness to its crushing weight, which means there is no mechanism for its legitimate release. The anxiety of the lone wolf is the anxiety of the sole decision-maker who knows that every single failure, every missed opportunity, every poorly chosen path traces back to their own singular, unreviewed judgment. It creates a psychological environment where the stakes are perpetually existential, even when the task is mundane. They aren't just making a mistake, they are proving the fundamental inadequacy of their entire self-sufficient system. The isolated person must succeed, not just to live well, but to maintain the foundational illusion of their independence, and that necessity transforms every minor challenge into a high-stakes threat to identity itself. They believe they are avoiding codependency, but they are in fact embracing a far more destructive form of dependence, the dependence upon the infallibility of the self. The isolated person must succeed, not just to live well, but to maintain the foundational illusion of their independence, and that necessity transforms every minor challenge into a high-stakes threat to identity itself. They believe they are avoiding codependency, but they are in fact embracing a far more destructive form of dependence, the dependence upon the infallibility of the self. This psychological dependence gives rise to one of society's most toxic and frequently celebrated lies, the myth of the strong, silent individual who needs nothing, discloses nothing, and therefore commands automatic respect. We have culturally enshrined the emotional closed-loop system, confusing the refusal to articulate need with actual structural strength. This is not strength, it is a tactical retreat from reality, a psychological self-sealing that guarantees eventual decay. Vulnerability is not a weakness in the human operating system. It is the primary feedback mechanism that allows us to calibrate our internal state against the external environment. The self-reliant warrior cuts the vulnerability wire, not because they are strong, but because they are terrified of the correction that external truth might offer. They become incapable of hearing anything that contradicts their internal narrative of competence, sealing themselves off from the necessary friction of differing perspectives. This blindness is profound, leading to a state where they are constantly optimizing for a phantom reality, a world that only exists inside their skull, tailored perfectly to their singular, uncorrected assumptions. They are not independent, they are pathologically uncalibrated. They trade the small discomfort of asking for help for the immense, slow-burn disaster of proceeding based on faulty data, all to protect the image of the solitary architect who built their fortress alone. If you find value in dissecting these deeply embedded psychological narratives and believe that intellectual rigor must precede comforting simplification, and if you are committed to engaging with the kind of challenging truth that most platforms actively avoid, then please subscribe now. It ensures this kind of deep analytical content can continue to be produced, offering genuine clarity in a marketplace flooded with motivational platitudes. This self-sealing leads them to mistake resistance for resilience and avoidance for wisdom. The self-reliant person systematically purges two things from their life: requests and recognition. They must refuse requests because accepting aid invalidates the principle of autonomy, but they must also subtly refuse recognition, even when it is deserved, because recognition implies a debt to the external system that provided the validation. They are perpetually standing outside the circle of shared humanity, perpetually suspicious that any connection is merely a precursor to an obligation. This paranoia is the hidden tax of their chosen freedom. The ultimate irony is that true independence, the ability to act effectively and deliberately in the world, is not achieved through total severance, but through sophisticated integration. It requires a high degree of social competence, the subtle understanding of how to leverage communal resources and psychological support when necessary, without becoming captive to them. The truly capable individual understands the nature of interdependence. The pseudo-independent individual only understands the fantasy of absolute isolation. They confuse isolation with immunity, but isolation is merely an incubation chamber for unchecked psychological error. The core engine of this suffering is not strength, but a devastatingly high catastrophic failure threshold. The pseudo-independent person operates under the absolute conviction that any acknowledgement of need, any request for aid, will inevitably lead to an existential collapse of the self. They do not merely fear inconvenience, they fear annihilation. They view vulnerability not as a prerequisite for deep human connection, but as an unforgivable structural flaw in their psychic architecture, a point of entry for betrayal or manipulation that must be sealed off at all costs. This explains the pathological refusal to accept even minor assistance. The small favor is perceived as the thin end of a very sharp wedge, the first step towards a total loss of autonomy. They sacrifice agility for rigidity, mistaking the refusal to bend for an unbreakable quality, unaware that only the flexible survive true stress. Life demands continuous adaptation, but the fiercely self-reliant individual must keep their environment and their emotional state perfectly static, because movement introduces variables they cannot control. They are trapped in a self-imposed psychological state of siege, constantly using enormous reserves of energy to maintain a perimeter that should have been disbanded years ago. This is why they suffer. They are exhausting themselves maintaining an unsustainable thermodynamic system, constantly pumping effort in to fight the natural entropy of human existence. The price they pay is the inability to experience genuine relief, genuine reciprocity, or genuine rest. They become adept at emotional triage, prioritizing the maintenance of the fortress over the actual nourishment of the inhabitant, leaving the self perpetually depleted and fundamentally unloved, because their primary relationship is with their own defenses, not with their actual being. We are now venturing into the deep, shielded architecture of the psyche, the defenses that most people refuse to acknowledge, the hidden contracts we make with pain. If you find yourself nodding along, realizing that this level of unflinching psychological honesty is vital for your own growth, the kind of honesty that requires careful, dedicated research and presentation, then I ask you again to pause and subscribe. Supporting this channel is not just an endorsement of the content, it is an investment in the continued production of radical intellectual clarity over comforting societal lies. The commitment to relentless self-reliance is therefore a trauma response masquerading as a moral virtue, a desperately held belief that if they can just build a high enough wall, the pain of the past can never leap over it. But the walls they construct are porous to time and corrosion, and the true danger is that by walling out pain, they have inadvertently walled out healing. Healing requires acknowledging the wounds, and acknowledging the wounds requires momentary vulnerability, the very thing their entire defensive structure is designed to prevent. They become locked in a perpetual reenactment of independence, living a lie that demands constant, punishing vigilance. This vigilance is the true anchor dragging them down, forcing them to reject the very elements that could elevate their actual capabilities: collaboration, trust, and the profound, stabilizing power of shared burden. The result is a life lived in a psychological vacuum, where every victory is hollowed out by the fact that it could not be truly shared, and every failure is amplified by the fact that it must be absorbed entirely alone. They confuse suffering in silence with strength, when in reality it is merely the silent amplification of suffering. This brings us to the most dangerous consequence of this self-imposed isolation: the confusion between competence and control. The hyper-independent person is often terrifyingly competent, a high-functioning machine capable of executing tasks others shy away from. But this competence is not derived from genuine self-actualization. It is the polished armor forged in the furnace of abandonment. They achieve success not because they love the pursuit, but because success is the only acceptable proof that they do not need the very things they secretly crave. The achievement becomes a protective talisman against rejection, and the moment they sense a threat to their absolute control, whether it be delegation, collaboration, or a necessary reliance on outside expertise, Their entire psychological operating system crashes. They cannot distinguish between sharing the burden and surrendering the self. This psychological blind spot manifests disastrously in the real world, turning potential empires into isolated, single-occupancy cells of brittle achievement. Consider the archetype of the self-made founder, the CEO who proudly boasts of working 18-hour days for years, who micromanages every department, and whose central mantra is, "If you want it done right, do it yourself." We lionize this figure, treating their isolation and their punishing workload as evidence of superior dedication, when in reality it is textbook trauma-fueled sabotage. I once witnessed this exact pattern unfold with a brilliant software architect who built a highly specialized firm from a basement operation into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. He was capable of writing code faster and cleaner than anyone on his team, and he correctly perceived that almost everyone around him lacked his specific genius. But the firm hit a predictable wall around 50 employees. It could not scale, not because of the market, but because the founder physically could not transition from doing the work to leading the people who do the work. He refused to hire a necessary chief operating officer because he believed that the COO would inevitably compromise his vision, siphon off his power, or, most terrifyingly, prove more capable than him at managing the business structure, thereby rendering him expendable. His need for total control was so absolute that he consciously, relentlessly, and successfully strangled the growth of his own company. He was not protecting his business, he was protecting his defense mechanism. His success was real, but its limitation was also real, enforced by the hidden contract he signed. I will achieve everything alone, even if that means achieving significantly less. The psychological debt of maintaining invincibility always outweighs the material gain of growth. This is the ultimate paradox of the trauma response. The fear of being vulnerable enough to be hurt again compels them to remain perpetually vulnerable to their own limiting beliefs. They actively reject the very mechanisms that could stabilize their success, the ability to offload responsibility, the safety net of shared financial risk, the emotional buffering provided by a trusted partner. They believe they are avoiding dependency, but what they are actually avoiding is the necessary emotional exchange that accompanies true human connection. Accepting help for this personality means accepting a debt, an obligation, and a potential future disappointment if that helper should inevitably fail or leave. They cannot tolerate the ambiguity of shared risk. It is cleaner, in their twisted logic, to fail alone, because then the narrative remains intact. The world is untrustworthy, and they were right to rely only on themselves. This narrative is more comforting than the devastating possibility that someone reliable was available, but they pushed them away because their internal wiring short-circuited at the possibility of trust. They confuse transactional competence. What can I extract from this relationship without giving anything real in return, with relational stability, which requires the mutual terrifying surrender of ego. The relentless, self-reliant individual, therefore, does not live in reality. They live in an elaborate, self-constructed simulation where every interaction is a test of their defenses. They are forever testing the loyalty of friends, the commitment of partners, and the competence of colleagues, not because these people are inherently flawed, but because the self-reliant person needs constant external validation that their initial cynical worldview, that everyone will eventually fail them, remains correct. They provoke abandonment to prove their fear of abandonment was justified. They refuse intimacy to prove that true intimacy is impossible. This is not strength. This is a complex, circular argument with the universe designed to ensure they never have to experience the paralyzing shame of having needed someone only to have that need unmet. They would rather feel the cold confirmation of isolation than the warm, terrifying uncertainty of belonging. The psychological cost is the gradual erosion of the inner landscape, leaving behind a desert where joy cannot flourish, because joy is, fundamentally, an unprotected emotion. It is a state of open receiving, which the self-reliant individual has banned from their psychic territory. If this brutal dissection of the independent psyche resonates with the silent truths you feel churning beneath your own surfaces, if you recognize the value of examining these defense mechanisms with unflinching rigor, then please consider supporting this work. Pressing that subscribe button helps us cut through the noise of superficial self-help and maintain the high-fidelity focus required to explore the depths of human behavior, even when those depths are dark and challenging. We are building a philosophy not of comfort, but of radical clarity. This, then, is the ultimate verdict. The life of relentless self-reliance is not a philosophy of freedom, but a meticulously constructed prison disguised as a fortress. The moment the truly independent individual succeeds in achieving total control over their environment and their emotional availability, they have only succeeded in building the perfect solitary confinement cell. The terrifying prize for achieving absolute, unbreachable independence is a magnificent, unbearable silence. True maturity, the kind that actually grants access to a meaningful life, is not found in standing alone, but in the intelligent identification of necessary interdependence. It is the recognition that the self is not a monolithic boulder carved out of necessity, but a complex mosaic whose true strength is derived from the unique and specific connections between its pieces. The greatest irony of the modern age is that we have become obsessed with becoming self-made, forgetting that we were never designed to be self-sustaining. We are relational creatures, forged in the fires of mutual vulnerability. The true courage is not the refusal to lean, but the terrifying yet profound choice of who you trust enough to fall with. Stop searching for the certainty of isolation. Start practicing the courage required for connection. The path to wholeness is paved with the necessary, painful, and glorious admission that you cannot and should not do this alone. If you are ready to dismantle the architecture of your own isolation, if you seek a community of minds that understands that the most profound insights are often the most difficult to swallow, then join us. Hit that subscribe button and become a part of the deepest, most honest philosophical conversation happening online. Philosophical conversation happening online. We trade genuine resilience for brittle self-sufficiency, only to discover the terrifying truth. The most profound freedom is not found in having no needs, but in having the courage to articulate them to the right people. The only thing more terrifying than needing someone is realizing that without them, your fortress was never a home, only an elaborate tomb. Philosophical conversation happening online. We trade genuine resilience for brittle self-sufficiency, only to discover the terrifying truth. The most profound freedom is not found in having no needs, but in having the courage to articulate them to the right people. The only thing more terrifying than needing someone is realizing that without them, your fortress was never a home, only an elaborate tomb. The definitive verdict on absolute independence is this. It is a high-functioning delusion, an empty promise of control that sacrifices the messy, vibrant reality of a shared existence for the certainty of isolation. True mastery is the ability to choose your dependencies wisely and to articulate your needs without shame. Stop protecting a self that doesn't exist in isolation. Find the connection, risk the vulnerability, and demand the depth that you know is missing. If this essay unsettled you, if it challenged the very foundation of how you define strength, then you are exactly where you need to be. We are building a movement for those who prefer difficult truths over comforting lies. Don't let this be the last time we speak. Press that subscribe button now, join this intellectual frontier, and let's commit to living a life that is actually whole.